Jacob Moore had moved into Oak Hollow with the hope of peace, a small cul-de-sac tucked between tall pines and neatly trimmed hedges. It looked like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. After retiring from 20 years in the fire service, all Jacob wanted was a place to work on his vintage motorcycles and take morning walks with his dog, Duke. But on a Monday morning in March, as he stepped outside with a cup of black coffee and a leash in hand, something instantly soured his routine. There, flapping gently in the breeze and taped across his front door, was a bright orange violation notice. Jacob pulled it down and read the bold letters. Notice of non-compliance. Unauthorized structure. Remove the motorcycle shed within 7 days or face escalating fines. No signature, no contact number, just a stamp. K.R. HOA president. He exhaled slowly. The shed in question was a small prefab structure installed beside his garage are clean. Neutral colored unit barely visible from the street. It housed nothing more than his tools, some parts, and the 2 motorcycles he'd spent years restoring. The county inspector had approved it. He had the permits to prove it. Still, rather than jump to conclusions, Jacob gave the benefit of the doubt. He decided to pay a visit to the HOA office, located a short walk away at the edge of the neighborhood, inside a converted ranch house. The door creaked open as he entered. The scent of lemon polish hung in the air. At a desk near the back sat Karen Reynolds, president of the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association. She looked up from a pile of papers and locked eyes with Jacob like she'd been expecting him. "You're the one with the motorcycle shed," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "I am, and I have the permits for it county approved, signed off by a certified inspector." Karen gave a thin-lipped smile. "This isn't about county codes. Oak Hollow has its own architectural standards." "That shed is non-compliant," Jacob blinked. "Non-compliant how?" "It's a non-conforming accessory structure, not harmonized with the neighborhood aesthetic." He paused, confused. "So, it's the color." Karen turned in her chair, pulling out a large binder. "We have rules. For a reason, Mr. Moore. If we start letting people build whatever they want, we lose what makes Oak Hollow special." Jacob held up his paperwork. "I followed every rule I could find. The shed doesn't break any local laws." Karen didn't flinch. "The HOA trumps the county on aesthetic and usage matters within our charter." Jacob folded his arms. "Where is that in writing?" "It's in the community handbook, page 43. He had read the handbook twice. There was nothing about sheds being prohibited, only that they required approval, which he had requested, and never received a response. "I emailed the request before building," Jacob said. "I never got an answer." Karen shrugged. "Silence doesn't mean approval. But it doesn't mean denial either," he said. Now, her smile vanished. "Are you planning to fight every decision this board makes? Because I promise you, that's a losing battle." Jacob didn't respond. He simply turned and left. Back home, he sat on the porch with Duke at his feet, flipping through the HOA handbook again. He highlighted clauses, double-checked emails, pulled out every document related to the shed. That evening, he drafted a formal appeal and sent it certified to the HOA office. He included photos, diagrams, permit numbers, and timestamps. He even copied into board members he'd met at a community event, but something didn't sit right. The way Karen spoke, it wasn't just about rules. It was about power. Thought the next morning, he discovered someone had left a measuring wheel lying in the grass by his shed, and small white spray paint markings lined the ground. Jacob narrowed his eyes. He knelt to inspect the markings. They were placed precisely along his property edge. Someone had been there on his land measuring. He looked up at the street and caught a glimpse of Karen's SUV slowly passing by. Her window was down, sunglasses on, lips tight. And that's when Jacob knew this wasn't just about a shed. This was about control. And Karen wasn't about to let go of it. By Wednesday morning, Jacob found 3 more white spray-painted lines circling his shed like someone had marked a crime scene. One line stretched directly across his backyard, cutting through the grass where Duke liked to nap. Another hugged the corner of the shed, and a third extended all the way to the edge of his garage wall. It was no coincidence. He checked his security footage and found nothing. The side cameras had gone offline the night before, blacked out. Someone had known exactly where to avoid detection. Jacob muttered under his breath and grabbed a tape measure. Pacing the property line himself, everything was as it should be. The shed sat well within his boundary, with 2 feet to spare. Still, by noon, an email from the HOA arrived in his inbox. The subject line read, "Notice of encroachment violation. Immediate action required." He scrolled through the document. A new accusation had been added. Accessory structure is built on HOA-maintained easement. The fine had jumped to $150 per day, retroactive to the date of the first notice. Jacob's hand clenched the mouse so tightly it creaked. Enough was enough. He printed the HOAS document, highlighted every baseless claim, and returned to the HOA office. This time, he brought a neighbor, Mr. Lindstrom, an older gentleman and longtime resident of Oak Hollow who had dealt with Karen once before. As they stepped into the office, Karen was on the phone, speaking in a soft, clipped tone. When she saw Jacob and Lindstrom, her eyebrows rose, but she didn't greet them. "We have a right to appeal," Jacob said, setting the stack of paperwork on her desk. Karen hung up the phone slowly. "You're welcome to submit paperwork, but the board has already reviewed your case." "Then where's the meeting record?" Jacob asked. "Who voted?" Karen stared for a moment too long. "Board consensus can be reached outside formal meetings when urgency demands it," Lindstrom coughed. "That's not what the bylaws say." Karen, her smile stiffened. "Thank you, Carl. But this isn't your concern." Carl frowned. "This is everyone's concern if you're fining people without cause." Karen turned back to Jacob. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA has authority to escalate enforcement procedures." "Like what?" "Shut off my water." Karen leaned forward, voice low and cold. "There are procedures. You'll see." Jacob laughed. With Carl trying to stay calm. "She's bluffing," Carl said. "But she's dangerous when she thinks someone's challenging her authority." Back home, Jacob walked the perimeter again, snapping photos of his shed, the lines, the surroundings. That evening, he compiled everything into a folder: video evidence, scanned permits, screenshots of emails, and a personal statement. Then he posted a message to the private neighborhood Facebook group. "Has anyone else received fines or notices from the HOA without cause? I'm compiling a report of questionable enforcement practices. If you've had issues, let's talk." He expected silence. Instead, the post blew up within hours. Comments poured in: stories of arbitrary fines, overnight citations, and HOA enforcers knocking on doors without warning. One woman, Tracy, wrote, "They fined me for leaving my trash bins out for more than 10 minutes after pickup. But my cameras showed they hadn't even been outside that day." Another neighbor, Luis, said, "Karen tried to block me from building a wheelchair ramp for my mom. Said it was a temporary eyesore." The most disturbing comment came from a man named Paul. "They showed up in uniforms once, claiming to be HOA officers. Told me I was in violation for hanging a flag. I asked for ID, they left, and walked away." Jacob froze. HOA officers, uniforms? Something darker was happening here. That night, as he sat on the porch watching Duke chase moths by the porch light, Jacob noticed a white SUV crawling down the road. Windows tinted. No plates visible. It paused in front of his house, just for a moment. Then it drove off into the dark. Jacob reached for his phone and hit record. He didn't know what was coming, but he had a feeling things were about to go from annoying to dangerous. And the horror wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. They were starting a war. The white SUV returned 3 days later. It was early evening, just as the sun dipped behind the pine trees and the shadows stretched across the neatly paved road. Jacob had just finished dinner when Duke growled low from the living room window. Jacob stepped outside and saw them, two men in matching black uniforms, standing beside the SUV. The vehicle had no plates, but sported a red and blue light bar on top, covered with a dark tarp. The words OH Compliance Division were stenciled in faint white letters on the doors. The men approached his property like they'd done 100 times before. One wore reflective sunglasses. Even in the fading light, the other held a clipboard and a small metallic badge on his chest that looked homemade. The taller one stepped forward and raised his voice. "Mr. Moore," he called. "You're in violation of HOA Code 7.3, unauthorized construction. This is your final notice." Jacob stood firm on the porch. "Who are you?" The man tapped his chest. "Oak Hollow Compliance Enforcement." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "That's not a real police department. We're authorized to issue citations and conduct visual inspections," the second man said, flipping through papers on the clipboard. "By who?" Jacob asked. "Where's your certification? Your ID?" The first man stepped closer. "We don't have to show you anything. You're a resident. We have jurisdiction here." Jacob stepped off the porch slowly, voice even. "No, you don't. And you're trespassing." The man in sunglasses tried to press past the mailbox line. Jacob raised his phone and hit record. "This is my private property," he said loudly. "You're not law enforcement. Show me your badges, or I'm calling the sheriff." The man with the clipboard hesitated, then said, "Sir, we are authorized under HOA Charter Code. That charter doesn't give you arrest powers." Jacob snapped. "You're impersonating officers? That's a felony." The two men looked at each other. Then, the one in sunglasses reached into his coat not for a weapon, but for what looked like a laminated ID card. It said OH Security Liaison with no name and no legal insignia. "That's not official," Jacob said. "You need to leave now. You want to do this the hard way." The man growled. "We can escalate," Jacob smirked, raising the phone higher. "Great, let's get it all on camera." The bluff crumbled. The two men backed away, mumbling into a walkie-talkie, then returned to the SUV and pulled off without a word. Jacob stood alone in the driveway, heart racing. Duke barked inside, agitated. Minutes later, Karen's gray Lexus rolled slowly past. She didn't stop, just gave a glance cold, smug, and drove on. The next morning, Jacob shared the video on the neighborhood Facebook group. "It caught fire. They came to my house last month." One woman commented, "I thought they were cops. They threatened my husband when he asked about our landscaping." Wait, so these guys aren't real? Within 24 hours, the video had over 1,000 views and even caught the attention of a local news blogger, who messaged Jacob privately asking for an interview. But before anything could go public, Jacob received an official letter from the HOA. The envelope bore the Oak Hollow logo and looked more formal than the others. Inside was a notice of escalated enforcement and a warning. Further refusal to comply will result in legal action and removal from premises per HOA compliance protocol. Jacob laughed out loud. Removal from premises? Who did they think they were? He flipped the letter over. No legal signature, just the initials. KR. He was done playing nice. That afternoon, Jacob drove to the county clerk's office and filed a formal complaint against the Oak Hollow HOA, attaching video footage and sworn testimony. Then he called a lawyer, not to sue yet, but to be ready. And finally, he contacted to local TV stations and gave them everything, because what had started as an overreach was now something else. Private security pretending to be law enforcement, threats, intimidation, false authority. This wasn't about a shed anymore. It was about a lie, and Jacob was going to rip the cover off. 3 days after the SUV incident, Jacob heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside his window just after 9 a.m. He looked up from his workbench and spotted the same white SUV parked across the street, only this time Karen was standing next to it. Behind her were the same two men from before, dressed in black uniforms, flanking her like bodyguards. Jacob grabbed his phone, hit record again, and stepped out the front door. Duke barked behind him, pointing at the glass. Karen was already walking toward him, a folder tucked under one arm and that familiar smug expression on her face. "Mr. Moore," she called out. Voice honey sweet, but tight. "You've forced us into a more serious phase of enforcement." Jacob remained calm. "You brought your fake cops again." The taller man stepped forward, flashing the same laminated card from earlier. "Sir, we're here to issue a formal removal notice under HOA code. You're trespassing." "Jacob, cut in. You have no authority. And neither does this HOA when it comes to threatening homeowners with removal." Karen smirked. "Mr. Moore, we have a charter agreement. Signed when you purchased the home. You agreed to comply with community standards and board decisions." Jacob held up his phone. "And I agreed to legal governance, not intimidation, by unlicensed private security." The second man stepped closer. "You need to vacate the property so we can mark and tag the structure for HOA repossession." Jacob didn't move. "You touch that shed, I'll call the sheriff." Again, Karen exhaled sharply. "We're done with warnings." Jacob took a step off the porch and pointed directly at the SUV. "Is that vehicle registered?" "Because I already reported it to the DMV. No plates, no public record. You're operating an unmarked vehicle with law enforcement style lights. That's illegal." Karen's face twisted slightly. She turned back to the men. "Let's go, document it. He'll be fined again." They retreated to the SUV, but one of the men shot Jacob a hard look before slamming the door. As they drove away, he kept recording, panning to the retreating vehicle, then back to the front of his house. That same afternoon, Jacob uploaded the new video to the Facebook group, this time including a breakdown of Ocala's charter and where the board was clearly overstepping. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of neighbors, some who had never posted before, came forward with their own experiences. "They told me I couldn't hang Christmas lights until I paid a late landscaping fee. Karen rejected my window replacement for being too modern even though it was the same model as 3 other homes on the block. I caught them on camera peering into my backyard during dinner." The story spread beyond the neighborhood. Jacob's inbox filled with messages from nearby HOA residents who had similar issues in their own communities. The local blogger published a short expose, and a regional news outlet picked it up the next day with the headline, "Fake HOA officers accused of threatening homeowners in Ocala." Karen didn't respond publicly, but her actions spoke volumes. The following morning, Jacob's mailbox was ripped from the post. His fence gate had been left wide open, and Duke, usually calm, was on edge all day. Later, a bright yellow tag appeared on his garage door. "Do not ACCESS under enforcement review." He peeled it off and called the county building department, only to be told no such order had been filed. They hadn't gone through any legal process. They were making it all up. That evening, Jacob attended the monthly HOA meeting held at the community center. This time, he brought a printed stack of documents, screenshots, legal statements, and a USB drive with video footage. The room was packed. He waited until Karen finished her standard agenda spiel: budget, landscaping, neighborhood, unity, then stood up. "I have evidence," he said, loud enough for the room to go still, "of fraudulent citations, false impersonation of law enforcement, and unauthorized surveillance." Karen blinked. "You are not on the speaking agenda." "I don't need to be," Jacob said. "You've crossed the line." Then he plugged in the USB and began to play the videos, first the fake officers, then the confrontation on his lawn. Gasps filled the room. Karen tried to shut it down, but no one was listening to her anymore. Jacob had taken a stand, and the truth was finally cracking the mask. Karen slammed her hand on the table. "This meeting is over," she snapped, grabbing the laptop cable Jacob had just plugged in. But the damage was done. The room was already buzzing, neighbors murmuring, some whispering to one another in disbelief. A few stood, openly angry. Others simply stared at Jacob, mouths open. "You've been sending fake officers to people's homes," Jacob said, his voice clear and unwavering. "This goes beyond fines and sheds. This is harassment, Karen." tried to regain control. Those men are contracted compliance officers. The board approved it months ago. Jacob turned to face the crowd. Really? Then let's see the minutes from that meeting. Karen froze. A long, awkward pause stretched out until Elena, one of the quieter board members, stood up from her seat at the far end of the room. There wasn't a vote, she said quietly. Karen hired them on her own. Karen shot her a glare. But Elena didn't flinch. She told us they were just visual inspectors, and that we didn't need to see the contract. I should have said something earlier. Another board member, Ron, cleared his throat. You said it was routine security, same as the neighborhood watch. You never told us they'd be wearing uniforms. Jacob turned to Karen again. Did you use HOA funds to pay them? Karen's jaw locked. Because I've looked into their company, if you can call it that, Jacob continued. It's not licensed for security services. It's run out of APO box to counties over. And those men, no certifications, no background checks, no legal authority. Gasps rippled across the room. I have footage, Jacob added, of them trying to enter my property, issuing removal notices, acting like they had legal power. That's impersonating law enforcement. Karen's voice dropped. Colder now, you've made your point. No, Jacob said, I haven't. Because you didn't just lie, you endangered people. A neighbor in the front row, Mrs. Patel, raised her hand. I thought they were real police when they came to my house. They scared my kids. Karen tried to speak again. But another resident interrupted. Why are we paying dues if they're being funneled into this nonsense? Where's the financial report? Is this even legal? Suddenly the board meeting had become a full-blown revolt. Elena looked across the table at the others. We need to vote on this tonight. Karen shook her head. This is not an official board vote. You can't. But Ron stood. You manipulated the board. You acted unilaterally. If you want to stop this vote, sue us. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. The power in the room had shifted and she knew it. The vote happened right there. 4-1. Karen was suspended as acting president, pending a full investigation. She left the meeting without a word, face flushed, shouldering past Jacob without even looking at him. But the battle wasn't over. The next morning, Jacob found a new letter on his porch. No envelope, just a folded piece of paper weighed down by a small stone. The handwriting was rushed. You think this is over? You've got enemies now. Jacob scanned his cameras, no sign of who left it. But something told him Karen wasn't working alone. He drove straight to the county records office and requested the last 2 years of HOA financial filings. What he found was worse than he expected. Several documents were missing. Others were signed only by Karen. And a series of payments, listed under security services, had no vendor address, just a code name. OUNIP. He cross-checked the alias with a corporate database and traced it back to a personal bank account under Karen's maiden name. She hadn't just hired fake enforcers, she'd paid them using a fake company tied directly to herself. Jacob sat in his truck, heart pounding. This wasn't just overreach. This was fraud. He pulled out his phone, took photos of every document, and called Elena. We need to talk, he said. It's not just about the fake cops. Elena's voice was tight. What do you mean? Jacob replied. Karen wasn't using HOA money for the community. She was paying herself. Silence on the other end. Then, come to my place. Now, the war had started with paint on the lawn, but now it was about to hit criminal territory. And Jacob was holding the match. By the time Jacob pulled into Elena's driveway, dusk had started to settle over Oak Hollow, casting long shadows across the pristine sidewalks and identical homes. But beneath the tidy surface, something rotten was finally being dragged into the light. Elena met him at the door with a nervous glance over her shoulder. I've been waiting for someone to come forward with proof, she whispered. Come in. They sat at her dining table while Jacob laid out everything. The flag financial records, the alias tied to Karen's maiden name, the so-called security payments, and the lack of third-party verification or board signatures. Elena scanned every document carefully. "This explains a lot," she said. "Karen fought hard to block any audits last year, said they were too expensive." Jacob nodded. "She's been using HOA dues to pay her relatives or friends pretending to be compliance officers, and the money's being laundered through a fake business account." Eleanor sat back. "We need to report this," Jacob agreed. The next morning, he delivered a full package of evidence to the district attorney's office, filing a formal report for fraud, impersonation, and abuse of HOA authority. He knew it might take time, but once it was in legal hands, it couldn't be buried. But by the following day, it was clear Karen wasn't going down quietly. Jacob woke up to the smell of smoke. He ran outside barefoot, heart pounding. The shed, the same one this entire battle started over, was engulfed in blackened flames. Firefighters were already on scene, hoses blasting. But the structure was already destroyed. One firefighter looked at him and said, "Started into spots, likely accelerant. This was no accident." Jacob stood in silence as the frame collapsed into glowing ash. No cameras caught the arsonist. Whoever did it had cut the power to the camera system first. A sheriff's deputy took a report, but without evidence. All they could do was document the damage. Jacob's insurance would cover part of the loss, but that wasn't the point. This was a message, and it was personal. Later that afternoon, Jacob found a legal notice taped to his front door, this time from a real law firm. The HOA, still under Karen's lingering influence, was suing him for defamation, claiming he had harmed the reputation and governance integrity of Oak Hollow. Jacob laughed bitterly. He drove straight to his attorney's office and handed him the letter. "This is desperation," his lawyer said. "They're trying to scare you into silence. But now that you've reported the fraud, the real heat's on them." Still, it wasn't over. That night, two neighborhood kids, barely teenagers, were caught on camera spray painting Jacob's fence with the word "rat." When police arrived, the kids gave up a name without hesitation: Kyle, Karen's nephew. Karen denied any involvement. Of course, called it a coincidence. Claimed Jacob was stirring up paranoia and turning the neighborhood into a war zone. But the evidence kept piling up. Then, Elena called. "Check your email," she said breathlessly. Jacob opened it. Inside was a forwarded message, an email Karen had accidentally CC'd her on while sending documents to a board member she still believed was loyal. The attachment, a forged set of board minutes, claiming there had been a unanimous vote to approve security operations funding months earlier. The names of the board members were listed, but Jacob recognized the timestamps on the metadata. The file had been created 2 days ago. Elena's voice crackled over the phone. "She's trying to cover her tracks." Jacob took a long breath. "She's panicking. She's going to bury this if we don't act fast." Jacob didn't hesitate. He drove the forged document straight to the DA's office and hand-delivered it. Within hours, he received confirmation. The case was now a criminal investigation. The local news caught wind. Again, their next story headline: Oak Hollow HOA president under investigation for fraud, forgery, and harassment. Karen's photo taken during a previous charity event flashed across the screen that night. The segment aired during the 6 p.m. news, and Jacob received a flood of texts from neighbors. "She's finished. About time. Thank you for standing up." And yet, Jacob knew it wasn't over until there was real accountability. The fraud ran deeper than just a personal feud. It was a system Karen had built and checked, unchallenged until now. And just when it seemed like the storm had peaked, Jacob received a call from a name he hadn't expected. "This is Agent Ramirez with the State Bureau of Investigation. We've been looking into HOA abuse cases, and your name just came across our desk." Jacob looked out across his lawn, the charred ruins of the shed still smoldering under a tarp. He smiled for the first time in days. The real reckoning was finally coming. The voice on the phone was steady, professional. "This is Agent Ramirez with the State Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Division," he said. We received an anonymous tip about irregularities within Oak Hollow's HOA. We were already watching several neighborhoods, but your documentation gives us something actionable. Jacob sat in his truck, holding the phone tight. So this goes beyond Karen, Ramirez replied. That's what we're starting to suspect. An hour later, Jacob met with the agent in person at a quiet coffee shop 15 minutes outside the subdivision. Ramirez was mid-40s, dressed in plain clothes, but carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen things unravel before. What you're dealing with, Ramirez explained, isn't just neighborhood politics gone wrong. It's part of a pattern. Karen's just one of several HOA presidents in the region funneling funds through shell security companies, then pocketing the money. Jacob blinked. You mean there are more of these fake enforcers out there? Ramirez nodded. Same uniforms, same tactics. They rely on fear, small threats that sound legal but aren't. Most homeowners don't push back. Jacob leaned forward. But they're not legally registered as law enforcement or real security companies. Nope, not even close. Ramirez said, we've confirmed your video shows impersonation of law enforcement, which is a felony. And now that Karen tried to backdate board approvals and forge financials, she's in real trouble. Jacob exhaled slowly. What happens now? We'll file formal charges within the week, Ramirez said. We've already frozen the HOA's bank account and subpoenaed records. But there's something else, something you should know. He slid a folder across the table. Jacob opened it and stared. Inside were copies of surveillance photos, not of him, but of Karen meeting with two men in a different neighborhood outside Oak Hollow. The SUV they stood next to was nearly identical to the one that had pulled into Jacob's driveway. One of the men had a criminal record. The other was linked to a defunct private security firm shut down years ago for illegal evictions. She's been connected to this network for at least 2 years, Ramirez said. We believe she created her own enforcement branch to pressure homeowners into compliance or silence. Jacob closed the folder, feeling something hard settle in his chest. She didn't just want to control the neighborhood, he said. She was running a business out of it. Exactly, Ramirez replied. Tax-free, off-the-books income, disguised as compliance fees. Multiply that across multiple HOA letters, and we're looking at hundreds of thousands in potential fraud. By Friday morning, the story had reached the statewide news circuit. Karen's face appeared again, this time beside bold headlines, HOA president under investigation in multi-county enforcement scam. Residents speak out as fake HOA. Police unmasked. Jacob gave a brief interview on camera, staying calm and measured. He wasn't after fame, just justice. And he knew others in similar neighborhoods needed to see that you could push back. Later that day, Ramirez called him. Again, they picked her up this morning. He said simply, charges filed, fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, misuse of HOA funds, criminal conspiracy, and obstruction. Jacob stood at his kitchen window, staring at the charred remains of his shed as wind scattered ash across the lawn. You get the others? He asked. Not yet, Ramirez said, but we will, and your testimony might be key to connecting the dots. That night, the Oak Hollow board held an emergency meeting, this time without Karen. Eleanor stepped up as interim president. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't political, but when she spoke, the room listened. We got too comfortable, she admitted. We let one person hold too much power. That ends now. New resolutions were proposed. No contracts without full board approval. All enforcement must be documented, verifiable, and legal. Annual financial reports must be made public. Jacob sat in the back, saying little. He didn't want power. He just wanted his life back. But he knew one thing now with absolute clarity. Karen hadn't been working alone. She was part of something bigger. And the only reason it cracked was because he refused to be silent. The final motion of the night passed unanimously to dissolve the old compliance unit entirely. There would be no more fake uniforms. No more unmarked SUVs. And no more fear. But as the meeting closed, Eleanor walked up to Jacob and leaned in. "You should know. Someone from the old board leaked your address to Karen's cousin. That's how they knew when to hit you." Jacob's face hardened. "We're finding out who," she said. "And when we do, they're done." Jacob nodded slowly. Justice was close, but one final piece remained. A week after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood had gone oddly quiet. No more warning letters, no more late-night SUV patrols, and no more fluorescent tags duct-taped to garage doors like warnings from a rogue state. Jacob stood on his porch early one morning, sipping coffee as Duke sniffed round the yard. The ashes of the burned shed had been cleared, and the county had issued a small grant to rebuild, citing extenuating circumstances of criminal damage. But even with the chaos behind him, Jacob didn't feel peace, not yet. Not until all the pieces were accounted for, that peace started to come. A few days later, at the next full HOA election, Elena, now acting president, had called for a complete re-election of the board top to bottom. For the first time in years, residents actually showed up to vote, not out of routine, but out of urgency. Eleanor ran for the top seat. She didn't campaign with signs or slogans, just a single email promising accountability, transparency, and limits on HOA power. Jacob didn't run. He was asked multiple times, but turned them all down. "I'm not a politician," he said. "I just wanted my garage back." Eleanor won in a landslide. 4 new board members were elected, with her none of them Karen loyalists. In fact, every board member who had once sided with Karen either resigned quietly or was voted out completely. With the new leadership came sweeping changes. A third-party accounting firm was hired to audit the last 3 years of financials. What they found was worse than expected: nearly $76,000 unaccounted for, funneled through vague vendor payments and compliance enforcement fees, all linked to Karen's shell company. The board voted to pursue civil litigation against Karen to recover the funds. The district attorney's case moved forward as well, now with multiple felony charges added. But the most satisfying moment came when Agent Ramirez returned for a community update. In a small town hall meeting, he gave the residents an overview of the broader investigation. "This isn't just about Oak Hollow," he explained. "This case triggered a statewide probe into HOA fraud. At least 3 other neighborhoods had similar operations, same uniforms, same scare tactics, same financial trails." Jacob sat near the back, arms folded. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were steady. Ramirez continued, "Your testimony, your documentation, and your refusal to be intimidated gave us the leverage to break open a pattern that's been running under the radar for years." Someone in the crowd clapped. Others followed. Jacob shifted in his seat, not quite used to the praise. But for once, it didn't feel like a fight. That night, Elena knocked on his door. "I thought you might want to see this," she said, handing him an envelope. Inside was a handwritten apology from one of the former board members who had quietly resigned. His name was Thomas, a neighbor from just a few houses down. He admitted to leaking Jacob's address to Karen's nephew, claiming he had been pressured and threatened with HOA sanctions if he didn't cooperate. "I should have spoken up," the letter read. "You stood your ground when the rest of us kept our heads down." "I'm sorry." Jacob folded the letter slowly. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he looked up. "Thanks for bringing this." Elena hesitated. "There's one more thing. We want to name a new section in the community park near the creek trail. We're calling it the Integrity Garden, and we'd like to put a plaque there, in your name." Jacob shook his head with a slight smile. "You don't need to do that. We want to," Elena said, "not because you tore things down, but because you rebuilt something stronger." Jacob looked out at the quiet street, where porch lights flicker on one by one, where neighbors waved instead of watching silently, and where no one wore a badge they didn't earn. Weeks later, as Jacob walked past the rebuilt shed, now painted a sleek forest green to match the HOA's new, updated guidelines, a boy riding by on a scooter slowed down. "You're that guy," the boy said. "The one from the news, right?" Jacob smiled. Maybe I'm just the guy who wouldn't back down. The boy nodded like he understood something important, then took off down the road. Jacob watched him go, the breeze rustling the trees around him. The battle was over, but the message would linger. Never let fear wear a uniform it hasn't earned, and never underestimate a quiet man with a shed and the truth. The end.